Bruce Phillips here. Good to join you, Ben and John. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for all the participants for joining. I'm going to go through some materials. I'll try to be quick about this as I can, so we have as much time for questions and discussions as people would like. But just briefly on myself for a moment. I'm a partner in the consulting firm of the NorthBridge Group outside of Boston. We're an economics and policy firm. We serve clients in the electric industry. I spent a number of years living in Maine. I went to college up in Bar Harbor at College Atlantic. I lived in the New Gloucester, Poland Spring area some years after that, before going down to graduate school in Yale, and then coming up to Boston. I consult, as I mentioned, in the United States electric industry. Most of my work in the last 15 years or so has been on climate policy in various parts of the country at the state level and at the federal level. I worked extensively on President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which was the foundational element for his climate policy. And now I'm working and assisting on this project. I'm not a Mainer. Living down here in Boston, but and my few years living in the state doesn't qualify as a Mainer either, but I do have a woods camp up outside of Jackman, Maine. And so I like to think I have some appreciation for the state and some appreciation for the part of the state that would be affected by the siting of the NECC transmission line. So with that, let me share my screen hopefully you all are now looking at the first slide of my slide deck. All right, the starting point for the talks that I give on this topic are really the same as where John started. I'm not going to repeat what he said about this chart or go through it in any detail, but what you see in the lower left-hand part of this first slide is important. It comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it represents a synthesis of a lot of extensive climate policy work that is the foundation for policies across the United States at the state level at this point, and a growing number of policies here in Maine. And these policies in the New England region and in the Northeast more generally include what we see here on this chart. Thanks to Governor Mills and her staff and her supporters across the state, Maine has now some of the most ambitious climate policies in the region and in the country. And her Climate Council is doing important work on this area. She's not entirely alone, and the state of Maine is not entirely alone in the Northeast region. Massachusetts has several very ambitious climate policies as well. I'm not going to detail all of these in the interest of time, but Connecticut does, Rhode Island does, New York does as well. They're not exactly the same policies. They don't all go to 100% decarbonization by mid-century, but they're all headed in that direction and pretty close to that already, and consistent with the IPCC work that John and I showed in the earlier slides. So what I'm going to focus on in this talk is what's the most practical and reliable way to do that. And those words, practical and reliable, are important. I'm going to come back to that a number of times in this presentation. So first, let's just talk a little bit about what this goal of achieving net zero economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions in New England means to this region. And there's three implications or considerations that I think we need to sort of touch on because they're important context for what comes later. The first of these is that the electric system needs to be expanded enormously. And by enormously, I mean more or less doubled in size. These charts on this first slide sort of represent the amount of terawatt hours or energy in the New England grid over the course of the year. I think these numbers are based on 2018. If you start in the upper left-hand side of this quadrant, at a minimum, decarbonizing the New England grid means replacing or decarbonizing the 42% of the grid that's represented by carbon-emitting fossil fuels, which is almost all natural gas at this point. A little bit of oil, a little bit of coal, it's almost all natural gas. And at a minimum, we need to replace that 42% of energy with something that's low carbon or zero carbon. If you move to the right then, an alternative formulation of what we need to do is to replace not only that natural gas or the fossil generation, but also the nuclear. And that would mean replacing not 42% of the grid, but 67% of the energy coming out of the system. We go to the lower left-hand side and say, no, our formulation for solving this problem is to make the energy, the electric system, all solar and wind. That means replacing 96% of the energy coming out of the system, because there's only 3 to 4% of energy currently across New England that's wind and solar, or at least that was the number in 2008. It's presumably modestly higher than that as well. But as John suggested, though, that's not the end of it, because the goal here is to decarbonize the entire economy. So we're not really just talking about the electric system. We're also talking about industrial processes. We're talking about space heating. We're talking about transportation. And the cheapest and fastest and most practical way to decarbonize not all of those sectors, but large portion of those sectors, is generally seen to be to electrify them. And as we electrify those other sectors, we grow the demand for electricity. And most of the analyses have been done regionally and nationally point to more or less a doubling of the electrical energy out of the system in order to electrify the other sectors of the economy. So that's an increase, as you see in the lower right-hand part of that chart, of annual energy in terawatt hours from more or less 123 per year to about 246 more or less. So that's a doubling of the electric sector, a truly enormous expansion. So the second consideration is that this decarbonization needs to happen with what is literally unprecedented speed. Now, mid-century is only 30 years away. That may sound like a long time to people. It is if you're in the personal phone, the iPhone industry, or Facebook. But in the electric industry, it's the blink of an eye. And most analyses suggest that the electric sector, I think John alluded to this as well, needs to be decarbonized first. That's because we have a number of zero carbon and low carbon technologies in the electric sector. They're known, they're proven, they're reasonably commercial, much more so than we see in transportation and other sectors of the economy. So we need to do the electric sector first. That means 2050, if not earlier. Now, what historians in the energy sector will say is that humankind, in the history of humankind, we've only really gone through 2 global energy transitions. One is from biomass to coal, and the second is from coal to oil and gas. And what some people would say, the optimists would say, is that we can do those global energy transitions, and we have done those global energy transitions in more or less 50 years. And that's true when you look at individual countries and see what Sweden has done or what France has done in deploying nuclear technology, a few other countries. But when you look globally, the time pattern seems to be much, much longer. And so what does all this mean? What this means, in essence, is that we don't have time, or we have little time for a sequential trial and error process. So if we had, say, 200 years to solve this problem, and it took 50 years for us to figure out whether a particular solution would work, well, we could take the next 50 years or 30 years and see if it would work. And if it worked, great. And if not, we'd move to plan B. We would try that. If it didn't work, we'd go to plan C, so forth and so on. And eventually, we'd get to a solution, and that would be good. But if we only have 30 years, that says we don't have time for a long sequential trial and error process. We have just one chance to do this. And that means we need to think about it, not in terms of what an ideal outcome would be or what our personal preference for an ideal outcome would be, but we need to think about it in more of a risk framework of how do we get to something that we need to get to, that's important to get to, but we have very little time to get there. So that's the second consideration. The third consideration, and this goes back to what John was talking about, that trade-offs are inevitable across these development processes. We have all resources with significant land use impacts and other non-climate impacts. I'm talking about water consumption, aesthetic impacts, and a long list of them. This particular chart you see in the lower left-hand side of the slide, is from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and it's looking at the land use requirements expressed in acres per gigawatt hour for a number of renewable technologies that you see in the lower portion of that chart: wind, photovoltaics, concentrated solar power, geothermal, fossil generating technologies, nuclear generating technologies, hydro. I don't have to remind everybody that those have important impacts as well. My point here is not to say that one technology has bigger or smaller impacts than others. My point is to say that every single technology option we have available to us, and that we are going to have available to us, has some kind of impacts outside of the climate sector. And so we're going to have to come to grips with these kinds of things. We're not going to have a magic bullet. We're going to come to grips with these kinds of development trade-offs. And until we do, we're going to experience the kinds of things that we're seeing today and have seen for many, many years. The photo in the upper right is from kind of my summer neck of the woods up around Greenville and Moosehead Lake. It's a public opposition to Warehouse's proposals for industrial wind. Of course, the Northern Pass transmission project proposal in New Hampshire received plenty of opposition. I don't need to remind everybody of this. You all have probably a long laundry list of particular projects that you would cite in this instance. So where does that leave us? So we have this three considerations for New England, and in my mind, the scale, the speed, and the non-climate impacts, these three considerations, make this challenge of getting to net zero by 2050 a truly daunting challenge, and it's probably an understatement. But the question then is, well, what's the most practical and reliable way to do this? Keep in mind, it's a limited amount of time, and so we don't have a long time for a sequential trial and error process. So some planning and some thought about a way to get there that will be both practical in the real world and reliable, not putting all of our eggs in one basket, I think is important. So I'm going to talk next about several different pathways to do this and what this means for a general approach for decarbonizing the regional economy. Let me start first with this pathway that a lot of people think about, which is relying by itself on wind and solar, or else wind and solar and battery systems, to fully decarbonize the grid. So just to set the stage for here, this is a picture showing weekly load and generation for the New England region in 2008. The vertical axis here is weekly load or generation in gigawatt hours by week, starting in the first week of the year in the winter, moving through spring, summer, fall, and winter again as we get to the right-hand side of the chart. The purple line up top is total electric load in New England. You see how it peaks the greatest in the summertime because of air conditioning load. It has a secondary peak in the winter with winter space heating requirements, and then, but it's at least 2,000 gigawatt hours per week throughout the year. The green line at the bottom is the total amount of wind and solar output in 2018. It's summed about 3.7% of total New England electric load in that year. It's probably modestly higher now. It's obviously a small percentage of where we need to get to. That's not a problem itself. It is where we are. We got to start someplace and we can grow it over time. But that's for context. Now, what happens if we were to grow the amount of wind and solar that we have from the level I showed in the previous chart to an amount where the total number of gigawatt hours over the course of the 12-month period or 52-week period, where that total number of gigawatt hours equaled the total amount of electric load in the region. And here again, the purple line represents total amount of electric load. The green line represents the total amount of wind and solar that would come out of that kind of growth of the solar and wind industry. And in one sense, this is fine because the total amount of gigawatt hours for the two categories there are equal over the course of the year. But the real problem here is the mismatch on an hour by hour, week to week, day to day kind of a basis. And as you can see, just by comparing the two lines in those charts, we have a lot of surplus weeks in the winter and the spring, some in the fall, and we have an extended weeks of deficit in the summer. And just to illustrate this a little bit more clearly to drive the point home, This next slide shows the same kind of results, but it only shows the difference between load and solar and wind output. It doesn't show the absolute amounts, it just shows the difference between those two. The other change here is I had added in a battery system that's equal to 1/2 of the size of the New England electric grid, which is technically possible. It's a proven technology, and with manufacturing capability, we could scale it up to that. It's, of course, unprecedented in the United States today. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but just to say it's intended to be an ambitious assumption. So if we scale up the wind and solar and we build a battery system, that's half the size of the New England grid, this is what we get. We're still left with, if you look there in the middle of the chart, these extended periods of deficit in the summer. We're talking about several weeks or maybe even a couple months at a time, where at its peak, we have deficits of 15 to upwards of 20–25% of average weekly load. So, and just to be clear, when I talk about deficits here, we're talking about turning off people's electricity, right? That's what this means. And I've never been a public utilities commissioner in my career, but I've been before many of them. And I know nothing upsets public utility commissioners more than complaints for customers when their lights go off. And so I don't think that this kind of an outcome would be very acceptable to customers or policymakers. And I would just like to note in closing too, that this is not just a seasonal problem. This is not just a summer-winter problem, but we have these periods of curtailment in the winter, which you see on the right-hand side of that chart, and on the left-hand side as well. And these are obviously periods of time when the wind is calm in the winter, which we have as well. So that's part of the problem with the solar and wind pathway by itself. Now, fortunately, we have a number of options to address this problem. All of these rely a lot on wind and solar as the foundation for decarbonization, but they do something above and beyond the kind of formulation that I've been talking about. The first of these simply builds yet more wind and solar and yet more batteries, so that we have enough wind and solar not only to meet annual load, but to eliminate all those periods of multi-week deficit that I showed on this earlier chart. That's one approach. These other 5 approaches all combine a lot of wind and solar with some other technology. And I'm not going to go through them in detail. Happy to talk about it in another setting. It's way too much for this.
Bruce, this is Ben. If I can interrupt, Peter Garrett posted a question. With these calculations on current and future load, what consideration is given to energy efficiency for buildings and transport? So how does that factor in here?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So let me just go back to this for a minute then. So there's a couple things that are not in these load estimates. And let me just go back one more chart. The purple line that I was showing earlier is a representation of 2018 New England load. And so that reflects the impact of all of the energy efficiency programs that we have in place that are operating across New England as of 2018. It obviously does not have, reflect the impact of future energy efficiency programs, and that's significant. But let me also remind you, it does not include the doubling of the electric sector that we need to decarbonize transportation and industry and space heating. And when folks do these broad national studies, when they're talking about decarbonizing the entire economy, and those studies say we need to double the size of energy output across a given region or the country, what they're saying is the expansion of the electric sector is a doubling on a net basis. So it's an expansion to decarbonize these other sectors, accounting for the added energy efficiency programs we have in the electric sector. So it's a good clarifying question. I'm glad you asked it. I'm not sure that it really changes the outcome of this. But I'm happy to follow up on that later if you'd like. So back to here, Again, a number of other, kind of possible solutions to this sort of curtailment problem with wind and solar: zero carbon liquid fuels, like as in hydrogen or ammonia, long duration energy storage technologies. These are not battery systems, but these are storage technologies that are designed to store energy or electricity for days or weeks or maybe even months at a time. We can couple variable renewable energy like wind and solar with firm renewables, such as reservoir hydro. That's another approach. We can couple renewables with fossil carbon capture and sequestration, or we can couple variable renewables with advanced nuclear technologies as well. So that's the good news. There's a number of ways to solve this problem. The bad news is that each one of these possible solutions has its own uncertainties and limitations. And that makes any single pathway that we think about a risky pathway, right? And that's why we can't put all of our eggs in one basket, and we can't only say that we should be relying exclusively on what our own favorite pet technology is. That's a risky proposition, given we only have one chance to get the zero carbon goal by 2050. So let me just illustrate this risk problem for you just very, very briefly. And I'm just going to take one of the pathways I just talked about. This is the long duration storage pathway. And for simplicity purposes, let's just think about 4 sources of uncertainty that are associated with that pathway. The first is, can we actually build the wind and scalar? It's wind and solar that needs to be scaled up 3 or more times to the size of the current electric system. This kind of follows on, John's example from earlier on. It's a question: can we actually site and permit all this stuff? We know in concept we can build it; they're proven technologies, but can we actually site and permit this stuff? Secondly, will the public tolerate a doubling of transmission infrastructure? Most of the national studies say that that decarbonization pathways that rely solely on wind and solar, even if they have storage, require more or less a doubling of today's transmission infrastructure. Can we site and permit that? A third question would be, will the long duration storage, can it be proven? Can it be demonstrated? Can it be commercialized? And can it be built at scale that we need to sort of decarbonize the system? There's a whole host of questions embedded in there. And then finally, will customers accept demand management programs covering roughly half of load? Because most of the federal national studies that have been done on this topic show that there's still a lot of demand management we have in this pathway. So 4 questions, and certainly, in concept, we can do all of those, right? This is America. We've done all sorts of incredible things. But let's just think about this in terms of a simple mental math kind of exercise. And let's say we got these 4 questions, and let's say we in our optimistic selves, that we have an 85% chance of doing each one of those. And so if the only thing we need to do to make this a pathway successful is to build out the solar and wind, well, then we'd have an 85% chance of success. Well, that's pretty good. It's not 100%, but 85% chance is a pretty high probability of success. The problem is we need to do more than that. And if we have to both build out wind and solar and expand the transmission system, that is double the transmission system, if each one of those was highly likely at 85%, the combined probability drops to 72. And so forth and so on, as we add in the uncertainty around long-term storage and the uncertainty around demand response, the cumulative probability drops to 61% and 52%, and which is really just a coin flip, right? And if a coin flip was the best we could do to achieve the net zero by 2050 goal, then that's the best we could do. But I would say, and I'm going to kind of outline some thoughts later on about how to raise that probability to something that's really much higher. And let me just say too, I don't mean to pick here on wind and solar in particular, because this kind of example applies to any one of the 6 pathways that I just went through. The point here is that relying on any single pathway by itself is an inherently risky proposition, and we ought to be able to do better than that. So what is that better way to do? And so I call this sort of risk-based, decarbonization. I think of it as being both more practical and more reliable. The first is to deploy ASAP, as soon as possible, all the technologies we have that are low carbon and zero carbon that are proven and commercial. because this speeds the transition and improves the odds of full and timely decarbonization. Everything that we deploy today does not have to be deployed 10 years or 20 years or 25 years later, right? And it's hard enough to sort of deploy what we're going to need to deploy in 10 or 20 years, but if we avoid deploying what we can deploy today, it only aggravates that problem and decreases the risk of eventual success. The second part of this is diversity. We need to diversify what we do build out. We need to build out all the wind and solar and batteries as quickly as we can, but we also need to complement that with other generation that is firm and scalable. I'm going to talk a little bit more about firm and scalable technologies in a minute, but these are important because they balance the wind and solar output, and so they address the curtailment issue that I talked about earlier. They lessen some of the land use impacts that John talked about because they tend to be more energy dense and therefore have less, lower land use requirements. And by diversifying the technology pathways, not just relying on a single technology pathway, but multiple technology pathways, it increases the odds of success. And you could think through a simple mental math example of that, the way we just did for a single scenario a minute ago. Third, we need to address the technical, economic, and public acceptance and siting barriers to low carbon investment. You can think about this as a simple technology innovation initiative, which is certainly at its core. But I would say that we need to extend that to social science about what the public will accept and what will not accept, and how to address siting barriers and permitting barriers to low carbon investment, so we can actually build this stuff as quickly and as large scale as we need to in order to get to the decarbonization goal. And finally, we need to adjust the deployment mix over time. We can't know today what we're going to need to deploy 10 or 20 years from now, so we need to be flexible. So that's sort of the general approach. A couple thoughts quickly with two final slides. First, on what do we mean by firm and scalable technologies, and what does this mean for the NECEC project, which you can see where this is headed. And as I kind of went through before, we have sort of 5 technologies that I would think of, which would be firm and scalable low carbon technologies. These are listed in the table. The question here is how many of them are technically proven, and how many of them are actually cost competitive in New England today, right? So long duration energy storage, there's a couple of thermal energy storage facilities around the world, one in northern Canada and one in Russia someplace, but it's not really technically proven in the United States today. Who knows whether it'll be cost competitive. There's research going on there. Hopefully it will be. It's not today. Zero carbon liquid fuels, electrolysis and steam methane reformation are proven technologies widely in use in other parts of the United States for industrial purposes, not cost competitive in this region today. Fossil carbon capture, pretty much the same. Proven technology, both in Texas and in Canada. New projects underway, stimulated by federal tax credits, not cost competitive today in New England for a variety of reasons. New nuclear, current nuclear technology, well proven, not being deployed very actively with 1 or 2 exceptions here in the United States, but very actively overseas today. Advanced technologies, where most of the action is here in the United States, that is being advanced by a number of bright, ambitious people whose mission in the world is to address the climate crisis. Will hopefully be successful over time, but it's not been technically proven yet today, and we'll see what the economics turn out to be. So the last one on the list is reservoir hydro, and we know it's technically proven, and we know it's cost competitive in New England. So it's the only firm, scalable technology that we can couple with variable renewables to address the curtailment problem today. 10 years from now, we might have other options on the table. Hopefully we will. The more options, the better. The more options, the better chance we have of decarbonizing the grid. But today, reservoir hydro is the only firm and scalable option we have. So one last thought here, because I don't mean to overemphasize the firm, scalable technologies. And I don't want to discourage the solar and wind developers, either on this call or elsewhere, from engaging in their enterprises, because there's a huge growth opportunity here as we look out over the coming years and decades. what this chart illustrates, and maybe in the interest of time here, yeah, I'm not gonna go through this slide in detail, but the point here is that as big and as large as the NECEC project is, and as big and as large as the Vineyard Wind project is that you may be familiar with, these are fairly small or modest, I would say, in the context of the growth opportunity that we have. And so that green bar on the top chart, or the top bar of the right-hand figure, represents the amount, the minimum amount of zero carbon energy that we need to develop and build and install over the next 3 decades. And I would just urge us to try to avoid this Hunger Games dynamic where we're pitting one zero carbon technology against another in a world where we think we have a limited pie, and instead try to grow the demand so that we can achieve the 174 terawatt hours of growth that we need to. There's plenty of growth opportunities for all these technologies. One last summary slide, and I'm not going to go through this because this kind of recaps what I've been talking about. But let me just say in closing that, you know, one thing I think that I've learned, it was a hit home for me, you know, and I think for many other people from the discussions we've heard from the younger generation of climate activists around the country and around the world, is the huge gap we have between climate aspirations and climate action. That's the single most important thing that they've driven home for me, and the level of their interest in sort of addressing that problem. And so zero carbon, shovel ready projects of the sort that we have with the New England Clean Energy Connect problem, you know, are a way to sort of help close that gap, right? And it's not going to do it by itself. You know, to do that, you know, we have to get the 174 terawatt hours I showed in the previous chart. But, you know, when we turn away scale zero carbon shovel ready projects like NECC, we make it that much harder to achieve the goal at the end of the day. No project's perfect, you know, perfect in any sense. So I'll just leave it at that. Ben, back to you.